Okay, so as I was saying, so turn it in when you look. This is odd because I didn't actually submit papers. I can't show you what it looks like on my screen. But when you go into the submission system, first of all, I added on your left-hand side of Canvas, there should now be modules and whatever. There should also be one called assignments. You're going to want to click on that one. You can see your assignments, but you can also see that's where you're going to look to find your anonymous peer review. There's many ways of getting it, but that's by far the easiest. So I added that so you can now see all of the assignments you have. And if you click back on your assignment, there should be a little colored tab next to your paper. And if it's green, it was clean. If it was yellow, it's and if it's red, you have some serious duplication. Now, unfortunately, some of you have serious duplication because you had two authors, both submit. And if you see the 100% because your paper exactly matches, well, that's okay. You know to ignore that. I know to ignore that. That's not a problem. Oh, sorry about that. But if you accidentally submit the same paper to a conference twice under two different IDs, they get the same problem. And normally you should withdraw one. But I forgot to mention that if there are two of you, it will automatically check everyone in the class to make sure you're not doing that. So look through the other ones, okay, especially the grammar stuff, right? So the goal of this class is not me to be your proofreader because I'm not a good proofreader. I will generate more typos than most of you. My English at one level may be better, but my typing and my dyslexia makes lots of other things really bad. So you should be using tools like Grammarly, which I talked about before. Turn It In will also give you some feedback. You can look at both of those to sort of get feedback. I will actually try and give you feedback when I notice it, but I just don't notice lots of things. And I will notice some of them, and it'll seem like, why did you pick on this one and not the others? Because sometimes when I look at things, it feels weird here. So very often I just highlight a large area, like there's something wrong somewhere in here, and I don't know exactly where because I don't see it that way. But, so your Turn It In stuff is for your feedback. If you actually copied large sentences, that will be a problem because when you write papers, you don't, without quoting, copy large sentences. If you get blocks of things where you take very standard terminology that you pretty much did lift from another paper and put them in that order, you have this person's name and this person's name and this person's name and this whatever, it will highlight those as plagiarism in that section and you'll get a score for that. You can reduce that by rearranging them, but if it really is just very standard citation references, every editor will just ignore it. Okay? But if it's whole sentences, not just names of people or whatever, then they start to worry about it. There's some limit they'll look at. Turn It In will not test on figures, which editors will often look at, but the Turn It In just has no way of analyzing figures. So, move on.
What if it says 20% here, it's in a green color, and when I open it up and there are different colors, saying that different patches of the same.
So the different colors are, so on the right-hand side, there should be actually scores of like 4%, 3%, whatever. The colors, when you do the detail, is to help you line them up. This one goes to this thing. And if it's done it right, you can actually click on the percentage area, and it'll show you the original source. So you can do the comparison.
I got the question about the peer reviewers.
Okay.
The problem is that when you published it, you said that if the other person didn't assign, didn't post it, then it would be held against you.
Yeah, pretty sure.
That was a typo. It won't be holding it.
Oh, for a moment, I was like...
I told you, I can generate lots of typos. If you're not sure, ask. If you think it might be a typo, ask. Good chances are it's a typo.
Okay.
It won't be held against you.
Okay.
Did I say will?
Yeah.
Oh.
I said it. I was like,
Maybe it's, I will hold it against them. No, it won't be held against you. So in fact, what I may end up doing, because we're actually, when I did the assignments, it was like right after the deadline. So it was like the deadline was midnight, and I did it like 6 a.m. on the next day. And I said, well, some people might still be trying to cut it close, whatever. But there's still like 6 people missing. So if you don't have one, I might actually just take those 6 people out of the pool. And if you have one of them assigned, I may just take all 6 of them and they get to do their own little pool all among themselves. And then you guys everybody can get something done. I'll look at trying to do that tonight. I was hoping almost everybody would have it done by like the next day, but there's still 6 missing. So.
I have one missing, and then the other one is draft from the first like the first draft.
Okay, that just means they submitted the first draft, not the second. So I don't know how to fix that. Now, so somebody told me that they submitted the draft and they updated it. So I have no idea how to get you to see a second submission of the same thing. Send me a mail, Mark, so I don't forget, and I'll look at it tonight to figure out what I can do.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've used the peer review system inside of Canvas. I'm used to the one in Blackboard, which was a little bit better. This was actually very painful because it doesn't even tell me how many I've assigned you. I have to do it by hand. So if I assigned you one and then I assigned you a second one, I have to notice that, oh, I've assigned you 3 or not. It's annoying. Any other questions?
So 2 things. First, I got a similarity score of 37%.
Okay.
But it's all from references.
Okay.
I guess I'm sure all references.
Yeah. So yeah, if you got lots of references, I thought there's an option where I could have told it to ignore references, but I guess I forgot to click that. I thought I did, but because I had to do the assignment, I forgot. Okay.
You can look at you put a little filter symbol, and you can say to exclude bibliography.
It'll show you your score without it.
And then ACMC CS conference was last week.
Okay.
A bunch of papers were published that struggled off in the direction.
Okay.
At what point do you cut off your servers? I'm not going to consider any more work because otherwise I'm going to keep changing different directions.
So that's a good, professor process or student process question. So at a certain point, it will always keep changing, right? So I would, if this was my paper and I had submitted it, obviously I wouldn't be doing it. If my submission deadline was a week away, I'd be changing it. I am the day before, like our NIPS paper, or 2 days before the NIPS paper, I found another reference and we radically changed the paper in the last 2 days. Because the most recent stuff is always the state of the art, it's the most relevant. So I might not put all of them in, right? But I'd probably find 1 or 2 of those and say, oh, I should work those in somehow, right? Especially if you have good categorization going, right? It's really not that hard to add a couple of papers and put them in the right place, right? Not necessarily radically change your story. You're just fitting those that fit in your story. Now, if you really feel it totally changes the story, that's a lot harder decision to make. Should I just, punt it? But if you think the old story is good, and to be honest, if your story was good, then these new papers shouldn't really change your story being good, right? They might augment it a little bit, right? If your story concluded, but no one's ever done this, and now it's done, well, then that affects your story, so you'll have to adjust. But, for this class, I will not hold any of that against you, but if you really want to publish it, including a few of those is probably not a bad thing to do. And again, fit them in within your story. So, other questions? Go. So, in fact, if you want to resubmit it now, so that tonight when I figure out how to deal with the resubmitted ones, I will have the resubmitted ones then, right? Otherwise, I'll do it and then you'll submit it and then I'll figure it out. So, submit it to before tonight and before 8 o'clock, and then I will go through and figure out how I do the peer reviews with resubmitted versions. So, if you haven't started your reviews, please don't start them during class. Don't start them until after 8 o'clock. I may do some reassignments or whatever. How many people have actually started doing their reviews? Okay. So if you have those and you think those papers are okay, just continue on, right? Because you're going to give them some feedback. If it's the wrong version or whatever, that's their fault for uploading the wrong version. Right? But and if you have somebody who's not assigned, who you couldn't get to your paper, I'm not worried because you haven't done that one. So if I change that assignment, it won't change anything. And I know some of you will be assigned papers, you're like, I don't really understand this. Do your best to give them some level of feedback. But you're not necessarily the target audience. So yes, Denzel, you have a tougher one. Mark, right? I sent you guys like Claudia and Dao. It's like, yeah, that's going to be tougher, but but you can still talk about it if it makes sense at the high level. Completely ignore the equations. Right? Just skip them. That's their problem to get them right. Any other questions on the review parts of the process?
The one you said that should be about 20%. Does that include the DARPA?
So I always ignore the bibliography. I thought I clicked the box to say ignore it. If I didn't, right, I would expect your paper to have lots of perfectly formatted citations that match other people's perfectly formatted citations, right? So of course, if you cite the same papers, there'll be an overlap. That's not a problem. No one, in all the conferences and journals, we always ignore the bibliography, right? Because we expect that to match. So, and if you get a smaller, so you could actually have, sometimes these tools pull out like random websites that have 5 words in a row that you happen to have in a row, right? But actually you think about the number of web pages, that's not that unlikely. If you used a commonly kind of phrase, it'll show up, and sometimes they'll just mark it, and I'm never quite sure why they make some of those choices, but we ignore them as editors, right? They give it to us so that if we look at them, we can decide if they're important or not.
You said we should use other people's terms instead of trying to find our own.
Yes, right, which increases the chance that they will do exactly that, right? If you're using industry standard terms, and those terms are long enough, right, then phrases about those terms will keep triggering that stuff, and that's okay. Especially like, if you quote them or define it, right, as defined by Johnson, this is blah, right? Of course it's going to exactly match. You just said as defined by Johnson, right? So, that's perfectly normal stuff. So we don't take those scores as numeric scores as anything more than look deeper here. And so they tell me where to look, right? So if you rearrange enough words that it doesn't get caught by that system, right, then I won't look at it, because I'm not looking for plagiarism by reading the entire papers that I get assigned. But as an editor, I get one of those reports for every paper I deal with. Not from, we actually use a different system, I authenticate, but it's similar.
If you put the sentence, for example, on the paper and beside them, it's good enough. Right?
That's fine, yeah. So actually, if you put a sentence as an actual sentence, it should be in quotes.
Right.
If you paraphrase the sentence, then you should just cite them.
Okay, so what I did was like italicize those words in the sentence, and then I put them in quotes, and then I
Yeah, if you put
a little bit of explanation, which is related to that, and it shows me a little bit of plagiarism, 2%. So I was
Yeah, that's fine then. Right? And I guess, but you put stuff in quotes, expect it to be marked as the same words, because it's a quote, right? That's just natural. So. Any other questions about the assignment? So, as I said, I will try and do some reassignments tonight. I was really hoping everyone would have them in by today or whatever, but hasn't happened. I'm trying not to push the deadlines farther and farther back, so I wanted to have you a chance to get reviews so everyone can have the feedback for their papers. So I'm trying not to push those deadlines back. So.
I know that I've really struggled with this assignment. Is it better? I just kind of made a decision on Sunday. So is it better to submit an incomplete paper or wait to complete it and submit it when you're done?
So this is a class, right? So from a class answer, you're now asking about like how much I'm going to take off if it's late versus whatever. I would say the real process for a real paper, for a conference, there is an absolute hard deadline, right? You either turn it in or you don't, right? You might turn in a paper that is not where you wanted it to be, but that's what you turn in. If it's a journal, in fact, this is why for many people journals are bad, because you can procrastinate forever because there's no hard deadline for the journal. I can make it better. I'll do that next week, whatever. So it's a trade-off. I would say for this class, because of the way we're doing the timing for the right, turn it in today and get feedback on whatever you have, because that's the only feedback you're going to get. Because next week, I'm not making people come back and give you feedback. So in terms of this, I would say get the feedback on what you have. And to be honest, that's even true when I'm pushing on a paper. So in fact, the survey example I gave you, right? I told you I started that story a day before it was due, right? Which was a bad thing to do. But by that afternoon, I'd already given 2/3 of the paper to people to read. Well, I was still writing, right? It was not like I'm done the paper here. Give me your feedback. It's like, well, this is due tomorrow, so here you go. Give me some feedback on the first 2/3 of it while I'm still writing the last third, so they can in parallel read while I'm still writing. So in a sense, you're playing a little bit of the same game. Your paper's not done, but you get feedback on the parts you have. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so now we're going to completely change back to evaluation. So last week we talked a little bit about sort of designing experiments, and we're going to talk about that. We'll see how this ties back in. So does anyone have any insights you remember from last week, or that's all a blur because you just forgot entirely about it and jumped right into, I got to finish this paper? Anyone remember anything from last week? Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I would say were the 2 or 3 biggest takeaways from the experimental design stuff we talked about last week. So maybe, in fact, I'll go backwards and go to a slide or two, right? So I would actually say this slide is one of the important differences, right? Very often when you're designing experiments, right, you're not necessarily going to find statistically significant differences, or you're not going to find differences depending on how you represent your problem. Right? This problem started with looking at means, right? And our hypothesis was that the star algorithm, COSO star, would be better because of this. But at measuring the means, it was not. So one lesson, outliers cause you lots of problems with means, right? Means are very sensitive. One bad point can mess up your mean. So if you're using average or mean, be careful about outliers. Look at your data. Right? And if you got a couple of points that are way off, means are a dangerous place. So median was better. But the second part was that even with median, it still wasn't particularly good because in this case, there were a bunch of variables that impacted, they're correlated. So if I just look at the distribution of data, that was problematic. So by coming up with this transform where we normalized by things that seem to matter, we were then able to get a difference which was significant. Right? So sometimes those the 2 most important things to get out of last week's was be wary of outliers and transform your variables to effectively reduce your variance by normalizing out things that might cause you variation. And then after that, it's just standard statistics were applied and we got stuff done. Okay, so today's talk, which is a talk that Paul Cohen gave for DARPA program evaluators, again, back in the 90s, which was I did lots of work for DARPA. I didn't work for DARPA. I did a bunch of DARPA programs. And our program manager gave us Paul's slides and said, I want you all to read this because I'm running a program and this is part of how we're going to work on some of our evaluation stuff. And then he asked us to come up with better evaluation metrics for our own programs and whatever. So I'm going to view this as some lessons for evaluation of programs, right? Even though I kept his original slides and title, right, and although I put them in my slide deck, right, they're really based on his slides. The lesson for you here is not that you're going to be a DARPA program manager. It'd be great if one of you eventually becomes one, but that's not where you have to be. But really, this is some general lessons on how to conduct evaluation of programs. Right? Forget the word DARPA, they're just evaluations of programs. DARPA was particularly important because DARPA ran very large, high-end, very advanced research projects. So that's what DARPA stands for, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And it's illustrated by a large IPTO program evaluation inside of what they're doing. But one way of looking at this is really a checklist for evaluation designs. How do you design for evaluation? Last week we talked a little bit about experimental design. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about experimental design later today. But in the middle, before you finish your experimental design, you want to actually start thinking about the evaluation design. Because if I don't know how to evaluate my experiment, I can design an experiment that I can't evaluate. That won't actually help me. I got to put the two together. So we'll put those in all these. So. And some of these are also useful because they give you an idea of how research funding agencies view it. So Paul Cohen gave this talk to the program managers, the people who run the research program at DARPA, right? So it tells you something about how they're looking at it. So all DARPA programs, they really serve 3 different masters, 3 different things. There is their boss, the director, the program manager, the person who's in charge of that particular program, and the researchers. Right? So we have 3 different things we want out of an evaluation. Right? The program manager who's running the program at DARPA, their boss, or their boss's boss, and the evaluators. So those are the 3 primary stakeholders. What do you think are the 3 stakeholders you have when you're designing an experiment for your thesis? That would be a very odd group, but okay, lots of Edgars. So who do you think you're doing your evaluation for? It's also a 3-way evaluation. Are we? You and yourself are the same. That's okay. Oh, me, so the professor. Okay. So the person who wrote the paper and yourself, so that's like me, myself, and Irene, right? We're all the same person. But, No. We're talking about designing an evaluation. So I'm going to run an experiment. I have to design how I'm going to evaluate that experiment. Who is the audience for that design of the experimental evaluation? Right. So one is me, right? I'm the researcher, right? So that's in the list. There is the researcher. What's the analog of the program manager? So who's in charge? Who's above you? Your advisor, right? Or your committee, right? And then, in fact, you might have the three being your advisor, right? And then there's the broader committee. There's three different people, right? So the committee is actually above your advisor. When you're doing your PhD, it's a vote of 5 people at your final defense. And if 4 of the 5 say pass, and your advisor is the one that says fail, you pass. Right? So it's not just your advisor. On the other hand, your advisor, if your advisor says fail, the committee might just go along with them. So you have to really understand where that's going. But your advisor might actually say, this is all I need to be convinced. The committee might say, I need something bigger and broader, because they're looking at it from a different point of view, right? So those 3 different viewpoints are sort of your view, your advisor's view, and then the bigger and closing view, which is really consistent with the 3 views you get at DARPA. So a really good design evaluation gives these stakeholders what they need. But you have to have some compromises, because the thing everyone really wants might just be too expensive. So you got to find a balance. So the goal, and if the evaluator, which if you think about it as your advisor, right, the goal of the evaluation is not to trip up the people doing the research, right, but to design something that can be evaluated and meaningfully measured. And this is a negotiation. Here it's between the evaluators and the performers, but in your thesis, it's an evaluation between your advisor and you. What's an experimental evaluation we can afford, that we can live with in terms of what it actually helps us show? The committee will sign off, and we can actually publish a significant paper about it. So you really want to figure that out. And the reason I put this before I get back to the last part of experimental design is you really want to start this early. In fact, the idea of designing the experiment before you figured out your research hypothesis and exactly what's going to happen is actually the way DARPA views it, right? I don't have to have a hypothesis to know what I want to evaluate. If I start designing my evaluation around my hypothesis, I can easily fool myself by designing a very biased test of just this one thing, right? If I want to test performance, I can design how to test performance without saying, oh no, I can only do this, this, and this as part of the test. So you want to keep it as broad as you can. There are going to be claims, right? So there's going to be a claim and hence a hypothesis, because the two are related. But the claim is not super specific about a particular approach or particular technique. The claim is algorithm A is better than algorithm B under these conditions, right? That's a very general claim, right? I don't get to know lots of specifics about algorithm A and algorithm B, right? So when we did the COSO example last class, we talked about the hypothesis being COSO star was better than COSO because it distributes the bandwidth more evenly, right? Well, a general experiment would be, I'm going to test different algorithms for how well they perform in parallel as a function of bandwidth, right? So instead of saying because it does this, I'd say, right, algorithms performance will be a function of bandwidth, and I can measure that performance and do something like that. If you're going to have a protocol, this is less specific for you, but if you're going to do something that says I'm going to use this data and use it this way, write a protocol, right? And they actually here was very specific. No PowerPoint, right? Really write a protocol. If you're going to run an experiment, it should not be, I'm going to run it on this directory of data, right? And I've had plenty of students that use the fact that, Python or Java or sort of, they can read all the files in the directory, and they think that's designing an experiment. I'm going to run all the files in this directory. Okay, that directory could be different tomorrow, and you will have no way of knowing what that is, right? That might be how you implement your protocol, but your protocol should be, I'm going to run it on these 400 files. And if you choose to implement that by putting those 400 files in a directory, right, but you should have a list of those 400 files someplace else that says the protocol is you run it on these 400 files, right? Because now you know exactly what the data is, and you don't have to worry about it changing. And you will be surprised how much time this will save you. Every student I know wants to avoid this because it sounds like I'm doing busy work to make up these lists of files and whatever. But I guarantee you that you will run your experiment more than once. And you may run it again because one of the files is corrupted. and you don't even know which one, or there's just tons of things that go wrong when you start running experiments. Having a clear list, okay, and in my view, a clear protocol and scripts to run your evaluation. If you run your evaluation by doing things by hand, typing numbers, doing things by hand, typing numbers, you will never want to repeat it, and you probably won't be able to. I know I can't because I can't type numbers consistently between one file and another, but you want to be doing all this stuff, having it all scripted. So the better you can make it in terms of here's the method, here's the protocol, here's the evaluation script, the more automated you make it, the more repeatable your experiments become. And then for DARPA, right, provide adequate infrastructure for the experiments. You don't want to be cheap about that. On their side, they normally provide some of that, or they give you a budget for it. In your case, I would turn that around and say, design your experiments so that you can run it on your infrastructure. Although we'll talk next week about AWS and cloud, so you can get to other infrastructure. So you need to know what infrastructure you can do. You don't want to run an experiment and say, well, you know, we did the experiment on this really small, tiny data set that no one uses because that's all I could afford to run on my computer. That will not get your paper published. Right? So you need to figure out how to balance those out. So from DARPA's point of view, they're spending tens of millions. So requiring the evaluation to provide more than one bit of pass-fail of information, okay, I'll turn that for you. Right? You are writing a thesis. And if your thesis depends on one single bit, if it works, I graduate, and if it doesn't, I don't. That is not a place you want to put yourself. Well-designed research is going to give you qualitative answers on a scale. And your question is not, can we do this? Or is A better than B? But how well does A compare to B? Right? And in what dimensions? Right? So if I just say better, right, and I define, but if I give you 10 dimensions, on what dimensions is A better than B is a much better question than the simple question, is A better than B? Because one doesn't give me a choice. The other gives me lots of choices to find some way to make your work out. And as Tony Tether, who was the head of DARPA back in the early 90s, very famous DARPA program director, said, passing the test is necessary but not sufficient for continued funding. In the last IARPA program, which uses some of the similar models that I was part of, not only was passing the test necessary, everyone passed the test, so they made the test harder, right? By an order of magnitude, twice. So it's not enough to say, well, here's what we have to do, right? You're working on your thesis. It's not enough to simply beat what is the state of the art the day you start your thesis. The world will advance. So you want to make sure that your graduation is not just aiming to beat what was there when you started, because other people are moving that field forward as well. You got to be aiming for what's going to happen. You got to skate to where the puck will be. So from a DARPA point of view, you want to be flexible, multi-year programs that taste the same theory in each year quickly become ossified. They don't really work out well. So you want to continually change the metrics and generally move them in front of people. You want to stay flexible in terms of parameters of evaluation. You're going to do a thesis proposal. We'll actually have half a lecture on the thesis proposal later in the semester. Your thesis proposal is a guide document. It is, I would say, half a contract. It sort of says, if you do all of this stuff well enough, you get a thesis. We give you a PhD. But the well enough is why it's only half, right? Because they don't exactly say how you measure it. Swati, one of my PhD students, was doing some really good work on heart rate, was making good progress. And just before her thesis proposal, or maybe after her thesis proposal was submitted, but before she actually physically proposed it, we learned of a paper by one of her thesis committee members that significantly advanced the state of the art from what it was when she was writing her thesis proposal. It did not go well, right? The world changes, right? So you got to figure out how you're going to keep those balances going. Let's go over the next one. Some new balance. So some things you really have to do. Any evaluation begins with claims, and again, you want to start with general claims, not super specific claims, because if I don't have claims, I can't have metrics. And if I try and have metrics that are independent of the claims, they're not going to be very meaningful. So you want to make those done. The empirical science, the task of empirical science is to explain the variability, and humans are a great source of variability. I would actually define that slightly different. The design of empirical science is to develop models to explain or reduce the variability, right? Not that experimental science tries to explain it, right? The models help you explain it. So what we talked about with COSO last week, we did two things. We reduced the variability by moving from mean to median. That was already reducing a variability because we were making it the metric less sensitive to outliers. But the more important part is when we did that normalization by dividing by time and scales, right? We now normalized away some of the variations we were seeing because every time the problem was bigger, everything else was bigger, but yeah, that's expected, right? So figuring out what's the right model to help you explain the variability is part of your job when you're doing experimental science. So of the three things we're going to talk about today, sample variance, effect size, and sample size, you want to control the sample variance as much as you can before you even think about the other two. Effect size can be changed as you change your mathematical model. The sample size is by far the hardest. If I have to deal with people or run experiments, the more people I touch, the more expensive it becomes. So I really don't want to try and say, well, this will work if I only have 1,000 human subjects, because you're not likely to get 1,000 human subjects in your PhD thesis. It's just too expensive. Demonstrations, which we talked about. Demonstrations are good, but explanations and solid experiments are better. Demonstrations show something can possibly work. Experiments understand why it works, how well it works, and some things like that. Most explanations involve additional factors. And to be honest, most interesting science is about the interaction effects, not just the main effects. We all know that if I scale by increasing the number of computers, I can get more stuff done in parallel. But the interesting part of the COSO stuff we looked at last week wasn't just that I could put more things on a ring and get more stuff in parallel. It's the relationship between how that's scaled and the way the scheduling algorithms behave. And so there's an interesting play, right? If I make my ring big enough and I have enough nodes, then no algorithm matters because it's just like everybody's in parallel and nothing's ever in use. So you got to understand how the two interact. The exploratory data analysis, which I already mentioned, you really always want to graph your data at least some level to get a feel for what's going on. Not all studies are experiments, and not all analyses are hypothesis testing. I would expect many of you will do an analysis that is not a formal hypothesis test in a statistical sense, because there simply may not be enough data. And although we could use bootstrapping, which we talked about last class or the class before, right? There's some ways of generating some more statistical data. It just might not be viable if you're doing software engineering kinds of things. Even if I could generate 15 different variations of teams, I can't run 15 teams in parallel and redo the same project 15 times, right? So you have to understand what you can study and what you can do a formal experiment about, and understand how to balance those two, and understand where you're going to go with those. Significant and meaningful are not synonymous. So significant in almost all experimental science means statistically significant. And that's something you'll have to get used to, because some of you will write, there was a significant change in this variable, right? Meaning to you large, right? Not meaning statistically significant. You should save your use of the word significant to mean statistically significant, and use other words like large or meaningful, right? I can have a meaningful variation and not know if it's statistically significant, right? And I can actually have, oddly enough, something that's statistically significant but not meaningful, right? If I have a large enough population, I can say that if we were to make this change, the median population of the United States would change by $1, change by a penny. With the size of 3 million, that change in the mean or the median is statistically very significant. But is $1 meaningful to any American? Probably not, right? So meaningful is a semantic term. Statistically significant is a very precise and very narrowly interpreted term. You have to put them together. So all evaluations, all experimental design begins with the claims. It's the most important, most immediate, and most neglected part of your evaluation plans. When we actually talk with students about your thesis proposal, right, I would be more worried about you telling me how you're going to evaluate some part of your thesis than how you're going to solve it. I can actually skip over and say, you will find an algorithm to do X. Okay, fine. How are you going to evaluate if you did X? If you don't understand what's the hypothesis and how to evaluate it, I'm not going to let you proceed with your thesis, because I don't know how you will know when you're done, right? What's the algorithm going to be? Well, there's lots of things you can come up with. You can be very creative about that. As long as we both agree on how it's going to be measured, we can make progress. And this is the way almost all DARPA and IARPA, these large government programs, run. They figure out the metric. They don't tell you how to get there. They tell you how to know when you've gotten there. And that's the most important part. So you got to figure out what those claims are, right? And claims, we already talked about things like X is bigger, faster, stronger than Y. Better claims, X varies linearly with Y in the range we care about. X and Y agree on most test items. It doesn't matter who uses the system. That's a pretty weak one, but no effect of different subjects. So if an expert uses it and a grunt uses it, they behave the same, right? My algorithm scales better than your algorithm or than a particular algorithm, which is the relationship between runtime and size, right? All of those are claims. They're a direct comparison of something. They're measurable and testable things with the right added items. But some things that are not claims would be examples like, I built it and it runs fine on some test data. See, it runs, right? So it runs is testable, but it's not actually a claim because other than to say I built it, okay? This is the other fallacy that people get into by saying, can we? And then they say, yes, see, my claim was, we can build it and it will run on test data, okay? Well, that's a very weak claim because there's no comparison, right? Is it better than something else, right? That's really where we have to do better than the state of the art, not just it works.
In the survey paper, do you have to have any experiments?
No, you're doing a survey paper. In fact, if you start adding your own experiments to your survey paper, some people will question it. Now, there are survey papers, and I've done 2 that actually had experiments, where what we did is, if you have 5 papers, all of which claim to be the best, and none of which ran on the same data, how do you decide how good they are, right? So then what we did in one of our papers, we actually took those 5 algorithms and we implemented them all on the same data. So we could actually do a direct comparison. And that became an important part of what we were trying to do in the survey is, these people are all making these wild claims. They're not testing on the same data. So our survey included an experimental part. But then it's got a real independent contribution, which is separate from just a traditional survey. And when your survey paper is 112 pages, you can get away with that. For what you're doing, probably not needed. So in this particular program that was part of DARPA at the time, right? This was related to machine learning stuff. The claim was that the system performance is the claim that improved system performance is due to learned knowledge. So there's a whole bunch of different learning models we can talk about. There's a whole bunch of things like learning that chooses its own features, hybrid learning, learning by example, learning by advice, perceptual learning, systems that support integrated learning, knowledge. There's a whole bunch of different learning things, and this was actually for a spam or email analysis system as a simple example, right? So if I want to say that my system's performance gets better because it's learned knowledge, if that's a claim. That's a hard claim to test, but that's the claim you want to test, is that the systems are getting better because of their learned knowledge. Not, for example, because I had more memory than the other guy, or because I had a faster CPU, or a better file data structure, any of which could make my system faster at processing mail, but not what DARPA wanted to test at the time, right? So if I think about putting them together and I want to automatically have my mail go through some training process. In this case, we're going to have 3 different learning models, and then, be output in the right folders. I can do training where I tell you it comes in here and it goes out here, and then later on I can do testing. I give you more inputs and I look at them. So, what's the natural thing you might look at for this to figure out, is this the right model? What kinds of things would I expect to test? Any ideas? Speed. Okay. But actually, since the system's performance is due to learned knowledge, we could have focused on speed, but we probably want to focus on something else. Accuracy, classification accuracy, right? That's a natural thing to look at here. So we'll make our primary metric classification accuracy. But what do I have to relate it to if I wanted to measure whether or not it's related to learned knowledge? How do I capture some of that learned knowledge? Well, we're talking about accuracy, so we're using accuracy as our performance. But accuracy compared to what? No? Anyone have any ideas? Unseen data. Well, unseen data is probably not what I need if I'm talking about learned knowledge, because if I haven't seen it, I haven't learned from it. Well, so from what I've previously learned, so one way of capturing that is how much training data you get to train on, right? So I can run the systems and say, okay, you get to train on a small amount of data. What's your accuracy? You get to train on more data. What's your accuracy, right? I can come up with a sequence or a design that says, okay, I'm going to vary the amount of training data and then look at my classification accuracy, right? So this is now doing a plot of that. One of the other hypotheses we start with, some of the important lessons that Paul was trying to point out, is that empirical science wants to explain variability, and humans are a large source of variability. So if I look at this data, can you draw any meaningful conclusions looking at that data of which algorithm is better? Yeah. So yeah, it's really hard to draw any conclusions at this point. In fact, some of them are variants of the algorithm, so it's a little bit more complicated. But so when we talked about statistics 2 weeks ago, the real goal of statistics is to try and reduce some of the variation by aggregating data. And so each of these, take it back. These are individual people, right, as inputs to different algorithms. So there's two things going on, algorithms and people. But the people have this huge variation, so it's very hard to deal with it that way. So when we look at statistics, right, if we had two curves and they were perfectly well separated, we don't really need a lot of statistics to draw conclusions. If everywhere one curve is significantly above the other, or noticeably, measurably above the other, right, we might decide it's significant. In fact, I can guarantee you there is a statistical test. If I have two curves that look like this, right, I can tell you a statistical test that will always make this significant. Because, now it's not always the most meaningful, but if I do a pairwise test at every one of these points, right, this order is not random, right? One algorithm is always higher than the other, and a paired t-test on whatever these values are will tell you that this is significantly different, right? Because if they weren't, they'd be crossing each other many, many times, right? So sometimes you don't even have to really talk about significance if this is meaningful, right? On the other hand, in this case, if we're looking at this plot, right, this axis here is the number of training samples. It makes no sense to sort of say, right, I can easily combine all these different training samples. If these were different people, then that would be interesting if it always was better, right? But it actually is still somewhat interesting if one was always better for every amount of training data, then this algorithm more efficiently uses data than this one. Because for every size, this one was more efficient than that one. So it depends on how you phrase your statistical test, whether or not this difference is statistically significant. But if one curve is always above the other, there's always a way of interpreting it to be significant. But when they're crossing all over the place, it doesn't mean anything. So really, we're looking at statistics when things are not obvious and when they're causing all these problems. And in this experimental design, if all I really wanted to do was do this, that probably won't work. I can't draw a conclusion. So what might I do? Might take the average. Anyone want to say anything else?
Select something. Select something. And just selecting a couple and compare.
Okay, selecting a couple of them is probably a very weak. So I would say average or median would be the first place I'd start. The only reason to look at this is they're all over the place, so maybe average is not a good model, but we'll start with average. So if you average over the people, so now I'm going to average over subjects. So you have to say average over what? So if I average over subjects and I look at the three different algorithms, relational learning, knowledge base, and SVMs, right? Still, there's no clear pattern to this, right? Yeah, SVMs tend to be a little bit down more often than the green one. So at every training set size, relative was better than SVM, right? Because at every point that's true. But the blue one is sometimes above and sometimes below. And it turns out that depending on what test I want to run, none of these differences are statistically significant if I measure accuracy, right, on average over a training set size. Right? So if I sort of project the slide this way as well, I get no differences. But now I can look at this and I can say, well, maybe it's because I have all of these little noisy different sets. In fact, this particular one here at 225 or whatever it was, right, did really bad, right? But maybe that's because when I get to that training set size, there's just some weirdness about that data. So maybe I should lump together and average groups of data, because I might have what's called small sample size effects. If I only have 10 samples in some bin, then a couple of points can make a huge difference in accuracy in those bins. So maybe I should average over the bins. And if I do that, where I sort of group them together into 100 to 200, 250 to right, so now I've sort of grouped them into 3 giant bins, I get a more consistent pattern, right? Relative is now everywhere above KB is above SVM. And as I said, there is a test for which that it's statistically significant, but not in the normal test that I would look at, because the variation as a function of training set size is so large that if I look at it as a single statistic, it's not meaningful.
Did you just explain normalization?
Did I just explain normalization? No. So grouping is not a normalization. It's really binning of data together. So I think of this as taking all the training instances of less than 200 words, and then for those who have 200 to 400 words, you put them in one bin, and those that have 400 to 750 words, you put them together. So instead of having, because I might only have one document with 125 words, right? So if I just break them into small bins, there's nothing there, or there's one, and the graph becomes very noisy. So that's not the same as normalization. So anyhow, but looking at this, although it fits this pattern, that if I look at it this way, it's statistically significant, right? It's not actually significant given the variation I have along that line, right? So if I don't know the different size of the inputs, right, it's hard to draw a significance. So, so why are they not statistically significant? Well, most explanations involve additional factors. So if the means are close together, the means are higher. So this comes back to looking at how do I separate those means. So why is the variance high? Why is there so much variation? So although here I've shown you the means, I haven't shown you the standard deviations, right? So when I told you that this was significant, if those are all the numbers, that's true. But if this is a curve with variance, and the variance looks like this, right? For the upper curve, we have 2 choices. And this, so if I view these as error bars, and this is the error bar for the top curve, I'll make that one black. And this is the error bar for the red curve. Right? The fact that I drew it the first time and made them look like one was always above the other was deceiving. Because if I draw error bars, right, they could be above or below. They're crossing each other. So it's one of the reasons why it's important to not just draw just the means. Right? If that was the actual data, there was no means, that was all the data, it would be okay. But as soon as I take means, the mean might be everywhere above, right? But the curves may not be any better. So there's no statistically significant difference. So if the variances are hiding in your plot, we want to find some way and try and reduce the things that are causing us variance. So if we look at exploratory data analysis, sort of look at what's going on as I do the number of training data, and I look at 2 different subjects. So this comes back to one of the ideas we had, was like, maybe we should just look at a couple people. Well, that doesn't get rid of our statistics, but it might actually help us learn something. So if I look at subject 1, right, and then I look at subject 2. Subject 1 has got I'm just looking at 2, rel and SVM. So subject 1 is way up here, subject 1 on SVM is way up here, and subject 2 is almost everywhere lower. Subject 1 was simply much easier to predict than subject 2. Right? Subject 1's emails were far more consistent of where they were going to go, but subject 2 was terrible. They were very hard to predict. Right? Maybe because their folders were not meaningful to the way the system was learned, or they're just very different, so it was very hard for the system to learn how to predict them. Okay, so when you start noticing those, then you want to look at your data and start trying to draw a little bit of deeper insight. So if we actually looked at what went wrong for subject 1 or subject 2, right, and you can look at them, maybe we should classify them into kinds of errors. So first is how many folders did the person have? That's a variable that might be important. How many messages did they process? How many times would they put them in the wrong folder? How many times did they move them from folder to folder, what we call non-stationary? And how many times were they considered to be ambiguous? So if I label the data a little bit deeper, then I can start finding out that for a whole bunch of the people that were difficult, 40 to 55% of the messages fell into one of those 3 bad characters. They dragged it and dropped it in the wrong place, they wouldn't have put it there now. So if you ask them tomorrow where this folder this goes, it'd be in a different location, or they could have just put it in other folders. So if you have lots of folders, that's more likely. So that gives us some idea where they were, but the people themselves had high variance, and in different and increasing ways. So that can cause us a problem. If the people are the subject of variance, and if your experiments involve people, there probably will be some of that. How can we try and reduce it? Well, so as one of the lessons was that of sample variance, effect size, and sample size, control the first before touching the last, right? You really can't control effect size. It's a function of your model. So once you have your model, it's sort of fixed. So we know that we can look at the means, but the variance has got the square component going on. So one way of doing this, a classic way of adjusting these, is to look at pairwise differences in what we might call a matched pair test. So if I've got two algorithms, instead of doing each algorithm separately, we do a comparison between the algorithms for every set of inputs, which is getting back to what I said. If I can do matched pairs, I can do things, right? So if I do that as a matched pair test, the same plot we had earlier, this one's not significant. Again, we're not showing you the error bars. This one's not significant, okay? But this difference is now significant because at a pair test, again, I wouldn't show you the variance. Paul didn't have them on his slide, so I can't put them on now. But these differences, the ones that don't have the circles, are significant, right? So we get something that's much better. We now have a deeper understanding of what's going on. But after we start looking at this, we might also start asking ourselves some other questions, right? If I look at this curve, right, the relative curve seems very flat. The other two have definite knee where they went up and then they flattened out, right? So is that, the other learning curves have a limiting effect. The more data I add, they're limiting their growth rates. These questions can't be answered from the data we have, but they present interesting things. This is one of the reasons why it can be very valuable to look at pilot testing. Okay, the other reason about pilot testing is at this point in time for the pilot test, you might say if we're going to run a big experiment, let's look at REL and KB, because statistically, REL is everywhere better than SVM. So I don't have to keep pushing that farther. So pilot tests can help reduce how much work you do later by doing a little work up front, and at the same time, they might give you some interesting questions. So as you remember, the hypothesis it started with was the idea that the system performance at a greater rate when learned knowledge is included, right? That was the goal. Why was this going to be better? Because of the learned knowledge. And the idea was that if you have knowledge, the more I've already learned, the more I can learn, because I can make new connections. So if I were to look at a system without learned knowledge and one with learned knowledge, then maybe I should be looking at them, trying to separate them. As now, before we had SVMs, knowledge base, and RELs, those are all three learning algorithms. But could I do the same thing where it's an SVM, but it doesn't get the same level of feedback? What would its performance look like? So you can imagine other experiments to help explain what's going on. More interesting for REL, because relative is doing a relative feedback in this loop, so its learning algorithm is far more. So I could limit how much it can learn by, for example, limiting its storage, and then get a different class of algorithm. So I can look at all kinds of different ways of looking at it. And all of these things then become what we are called interaction effects, which is how one variable affects the other. Okay. So coming back to the other lesson 8, which was that not all studies are experiments and not all analyses are hypothesis testing. So if the purpose of the study might have been to model the rate of learning, okay? Modeling, if I want to know how fast it learns and then predict, okay, now what would happen if I gave it 1 million samples to learn from? How long would it take? How fast would it be? How accurate would it be, right? All of those are things I could do as an analysis, but none of them would actually be a hypothesis test, right? Because I have no data to test that on. I just build a model and say, okay, it scales like this, therefore I make this prediction. Nothing wrong with that. It's just, remember, that's not the same as a hypothesis test. To make that hypothesis test, I would actually have to make the prediction, now estimate how big is its error and how well is it doing, and do that multiple times. So there's all kinds of modeling things I can do to make things meaningful. Make it analysis, but that's not hypothesis testing. And not all studies are experiments. So if I'm doing a study where I'm looking at multiple other people's results. I can do what's called a meta-analysis. I can even do statistical analysis of meta-analyses and never run an experiment. I'm looking at other people's data. Right? It's not an experiment if I didn't control things and run data. If I just take a bunch of other people's data and analyze it, I can still get some results on some things. Okay. So another thing is that significant and meaningful aren't synonyms. We already talked a little bit about that. So I can look at that the sort of analysis of the variances and get an idea how much of the variance was explained by the different algorithms. And I'm not going to go into how to do that, but I mean that's another way of looking at what's significant variations that are going on. So these were the 9 lessons from Cohen for DARPA program managers. All of these can be applied to your thesis when you're trying to do your research. And in fact, all of these now have gotten rid of the word DARPA. They started with the word DARPA program, but now they're just evaluation begins with metrics and claims, explain, reduce variability. Humans are a large source of variability, of sample variance, effect size, and sample size, control variance. Demonstrations are good, but explanations are better. Most explanations involve additional factors. Most interesting science is about those interactions, not just the main effect. So you want to try and figure out what additional factors can you have in your study to make it more interesting. Look at your data, figure out what's going on, do a pilot study early before you design all your experiments. And that's often, again, from a thesis proposal point of view, very often people will have preliminary experiments that show the idea has some merit and some design, and then you figure out what's the real experiment you want to run to make sure it's going to work. And then the last. So checklist for your thesis or for an evaluation design. I'm not going to go through it, but it's recommended that you actually think about here's what my data will look like. Here's what the analysis will look like. You may not have all the real data, but you should be able to design here's what we expect. Here's how we will do the analysis. That's also important because sometimes if you try and work through what the analysis is, you will figure out there's a variable I need to measure that I wasn't thinking about. Right? So for example, if I actually eventually might care about speed, right? How do I measure speed? Right? Well, do I measure it on a processor by using the wall clock time, by using system time, by using user time? Do I normalize it by having some first program I run to get here's the normalized speed? And there's a whole bunch of questions that come up as soon as I care about things that weren't initially what I was worrying about, but I want to measure them. So I have to find some way of normalizing all of those measurements that I want to do. Sometimes it's really, if I don't output it, my program might have actually known the answer to this, but I didn't output it. Okay? And when and where did I output it? If I include I/O, like printing variables to files, and I'm measuring time, I've done a terrible thing to my experiment, right? So you got to figure out, you got to structure your code knowing that I want to compute this stuff in a timing loop and then output stuff, right? And I got to figure out how to put all that together. So knowing what you want to analyze is really important before you write the code to run the experiments and do everything. So it's good to think about that up front. Consider how you're going to run your interpretations. It's really good to design your experiments so that no matter what the answer is, you have a thesis. Right? If the answer is, I run this and I will get data, and that data will be useful and I will have a paper out of it, no matter what the answer is, that's actually always a good design, right? So if I'm better than them, that's interesting. If I'm worse than them, that's interesting for the following reasons. It's really hard to do, I'm worse than them in every dimension and publish a paper, right? But if that implementation was, here's somebody who's got this theory, right? And this theory says this should work, and then I implement it and it doesn't. It's possible my implementation's bad, so you got to work how you validate stuff. But assuming that was true, it might still be interesting. But most often the time, what you do is you design an experiment so that this dimension and this dimension trade off, right? So there should be some point. I might not be as good at this end, but I'll be good at it at this end, right? So then you're designing it so you can do better in some part of the curve, and then that helps explain what's going on. So if you get a new explanation, it doesn't really matter why that's going to be helpful. At the very end of your process, before you start implementing everything, go back and ask yourself, what was the big question you were trying to answer, and start this. You'll be surprised. It sounds trivial because we did all this in like 5 minutes, but when you start writing your thesis proposal and months later you finish it, you might not remember where you started. So it's good to go back and review that, and am I really answering those questions? There's nothing wrong with changing your question. But your document, your experimental design has to be one consistent thing, not, well, I started here and I ended up here and now I can't connect the two. You got to put them back together. Thinking about your different stakeholders, you, your advisor, your committee, and really the broader research world, right? Is everyone going to be satisfied if I do this? If I do this, will it be publishable? Will it be good research result? And then run a pilot experiment to calibrate your parameters, make sure all this is going to make sense. So I've got more on experimental design, but I don't think I can. We go to 720, right? I've got 40 slides. I can talk fast. No. So actually, I'll save experimental design for next week, and I'll do some AWS. And I'll use this time. If you have questions about where you're at in your paper, whatever, just come on up. We'll talk about that kind of stuff, and we'll let it go from there. So.
You said that there was some person who referred to at least one preview.
So if a core of your thesis is you're going to significantly advance the state of the art in something, and 2 weeks before your thesis, the state of the art just moved from here to here, you will have a problem, right? So I've had I had a PhD student, and I try not to use names, but you can, with enough effort, you can probably figure this out, right? I had a PhD student that not only changed like what his thesis was going to be out, literally completely changed directions of his thesis. He was doing video surveillance, right? Had some ideas, and the world just passed him by, right? Because he wasn't moving fast enough. So we then worked to find a direction for his next thesis direction, because that one was completely gone. So this is a tricky thing at a thesis topic level. If you choose a topic that is really hot, okay? If it's really hot, it means lots of people are working on it. And your results may not get there faster than somebody else's results. And if that happens, then you don't have a thesis because your results aren't publishable anymore, right? Or they're a very weak thesis at best, right? But they're probably not publishable if your results are behind where everyone else was. So you started here. And this is, for those of you who are part-time, so that's an important distinction. Choosing a direction where everyone is running and you're running at half the time they are, and they're working full-time at this, they will probably beat you, right? So choose a direction where there's not as many people running, but it's still an important, this is part of the discussion with your advisor, is choosing a research problem big enough to be important and interesting to enough people, but small enough that you can solve it, interesting enough that people will care, and not so interesting that other people will beat you to it. Right? So if you go after the hot topic and you get there, that's great. It helps establish your your position. But if you go after the hot topic and someone beats you there, you might have nothing. Right? In the world of theory, where it's literally theorems and proofs, right? Two people will prove the same theorem. One of them will publish it. The other will never see the light of day because it was already published. Right? So that's the kind of thing that can happen. So that's part of the strategy of choosing your research direction. So the PhD student I told you about, we chose a direction where I was very sure no one else was working. But if he could do it, right, and make it good enough, because no one had ever done this. So if you're the first person to do something, it's not as long as you can, and I was sure we could, right? It's not so much a question of, am I better than the state of the art? I chose a direction in which there is no state of the art. No one had ever done secure template protection for voices, which is what he did his thesis in, right? That direction, no one was working in. So no matter how slowly he went, not quite, somebody could have eventually beaten him, but he could go slow enough and still get there, right? And he was a full-time Olympic wrestler, so that's part of his problem, right? He really had other things that he had to do if he wanted to be successful in this other part of his life. So if you got a full-time job, don't chase the hottest topic. So depressing though that might sound.